I am Will Ehgoetz, Senior Threat Hunter at IntelliGO Networks, an ActZero company. Just a little bit of a heads up, in the next couple days, we're consolidating some of our branding, so don't be surprised if, as a follow-up to this, you may see something from ActZero specifically. We are the same company. It's just part of our new initiative to kind of bring everything together from a brand perspective. So we will cease being IntelliGO and stay being ActZero. So again, as I mentioned, my name is Will Ehgoetz. I'm a Senior Threat Hunter here. I'm here to talk to you today about breach prevention and impact reduction. Got a lot of stuff to cover in this time, so I'm going to move quick. But first, a bit of housekeeping. This webinar is being recorded, and a link will be sent to you at the end. If at all you feel you have a question, you can use at the bottom of the screen, there should be an Ask a Question tab. And we'll keep an eye on that. I'm going to try to set aside some time at the end, probably about 15 minutes, hopefully, to get to those questions. Lastly, please also rate this webinar at the end. We'd like to gauge interest in this topic, and help us decide other webinars that we may do that people find useful. And lastly, normally in a live environment, which obviously these days is a little more difficult to do, I'd be letting you know where the toilets are. So hopefully wherever you are, you know where that is. If not, good luck. Okay. So let's get started here. I'm going to cover the agenda here. So we're going to go over what is known as FUD in the news. It's going to be one of our agenda points. We're also going to talk about how, when things appear in the news, they can affect your operations, and why, as part of breach prevention and impact reduction, you should have certain things in place to help you in those times, to help answer questions, but also to feel secure any time of the day. We're going to cover a bit about your security program on that base level. Then we'll talk about some of the technical solutions that myself and my threat hunting team see helping customers prevent breaches, as well as, should something occur, if they have these things in place, we see them being some of the most effective ways of reducing impact. Lastly, we'll talk about the best of both worlds, managed detection and response. Of course, we at IntelliGO ActZero, that is what we do. So marketing is making sure I talk a little bit about that. And then at the end, there'll be some links for resources that you can follow up with afterwards. So first things first, let's talk about FUD. If you don't know what FUD is, it stands for fear, uncertainty, and doubt. Now, what that is often is vendors and newspapers use it as a selling tactic and a way to kind of keep everyone going on edge, spending the money. But it's obviously not a good thing. And an example of things that we see happen, obviously, I'm going to use SolarWinds as the most recent one that's on everyone's mind. Something ends up coming into the news, and next thing you know, either the CEO or CISO is on the phone to you saying, "Oh my God, what's happening?" Everyone starts running around like chickens with their head cut off, and then either you're on the phone to someone else. And so I want to kind of cover these particular points in terms of that sort of a situation. So first thing is the oh no, it's the fear, right? It's the part where people are talking about the vendors are saying, "Hey, you need to spend money. We need to protect you," and your CEO's saying, "Oh my God, have we invested in the right things?" It's the fear of losing your job and doing a bad example, and having done a good job in your mind. It's that fear that, oh my God, what's going to happen to me? Some recent things that bring this kind of thing really to light is that recently British Airways, this would have been probably about last year, British Airways was fined 20 million British pounds. So that's about $26 million by the Information Commissioner's Office for a data breach. That's a lot of money. So some of that fear is really well founded. In addition, Kaspersky has some reporting about senior non-IT employees are laid off at 27% of enterprises after a breach. So there are examples: Equifax, Capital One, Uber, Facebook, JP Morgan. You can look this stuff up in Google, and more senior executives or high-level employees are being held to account in the case of a breach. So there's a good reason why they're phoning you, but there's also a good reason why it might be you that needs to think about some of these things. Next is having the whole story. Again, SolarWinds breaks. What our folks saw was people calling us up and saying, "Hey, you know what's happened? We need you to get on this right away." There's all this uncertainty around it. You don't really know the initial details. You don't know what has exactly happened. Does it affect your systems? What you often see is that there's a development of the investigation over time, and it's often too early to tell what the whole story is. A lot of times there's information that's proprietary or hidden from you that you won't know about, or we also wouldn't know about. For example, legal might have, and this is also something that might happen in the case of a breach at your location, hopefully not, but legal might have reasons to not be releasing certain information. You may have SEC filings to do if you're publicly traded. You also got a situation where the hackers aren't exactly going around saying, "Hey, this is exactly what we did, and this is what we're going to use on the next person." They don't advertise that information. And lastly, they may have customers that they need to notify, or you may indeed be a customer who's getting a notification. And even then, they're not going to necessarily have the whole story yet. So what you want to do in these situations when something like this comes up is you want to really conquer that doubt that you have about your peoples, your programs, your defenses, the measures you have in place, because that's what happened. People start doubting when they get these phone calls, when things are in the news. They're like, "Oh, I doubt that that we are protected. We need to do something now." So you got to ask yourself the question, do you even use the technology? We had customers asking us what we were doing about this breach for them that didn't even use SolarWinds technology. So if you recall, when that first started, that was the only thing that was known at that time. People are often very curious to the point of going down rabbit holes when big things hit the news. And again, that is something where you might have a whole bunch of people in your IT staff asking, looking around, checking the news, doing all these things. And do you really want to add something to your long list of security tasks that isn't relevant right there at that moment? You want to focus on the real issues and not have this loss of productivity, poor decision making at times. It may even cause friction between people in an organization where, why don't we know the answer to this right now? And the answer might be because you haven't had the time to really see what has developed and what the news is and what the reality of that news is versus what is being put out there in the public eye. And really ask yourself, are you affected? Great. So now, yes, I do use the SolarWinds technology. Am I on an affected version? Okay, yes, I am. Now, at that point, you can start to look into what really might be the issue and if you are actually affected. You, again, usually hear about these sort of things before the investigation was completed. A real forensic investigation of a large magnitude can take easily a year or more to really get to the bottom of it. So you got to keep that in mind as well when you're reacting. You don't want to do knee-jerk reactions. You want to do calculated, well thought out reactions with the maximum of information possible at that time. And you also want to make sure that you keep an eye on it a bit as things develop over that time frame. So really what that means is you want to make productive choices. Are the known vectors cover? Does this change your threat model in some way? Do you have the defense in depth already in place? Maybe there's some tweaks or changes that are needed. You maybe need to add some indicators of compromise, or maybe you realize that what is happening, even though you may not be affected, might be an opportunity for you to add some additional layers in your defense in depth, or even some additional monitoring at some component. And lastly, talk to the right people or vendor. You want to make sure that it's not a case of everyone running around like chickens with their heads cut off. You want to make sure that you have the focus in your organization. You already know where and how you should be dealing with situations like this. And you want to talk to the right people. Again, we had people coming to us when this first came out that did have SolarWinds. Well, I mean, you should be talking to SolarWinds. You're their customer. They should be talking to you as well. Talking to us, we can tell you exactly what's in the news, and we can tell you what we're doing about it. But the right people for your situation might not be the case. Those right people might be the vendor. It might be someone in your organization that needs to check certain logs or take certain action. So knowing that is a very important step. Now, we're going to get into how a security program, can help you set your mind at ease. Some key things about your security program, and also, how it can help reduce the impact if there was to be a breach. But as Clint's kind of pointing out here, I want to kind of not be a grumpy old man. I want to kind of set the stage here a little for you guys, and that is that, I'm not here to put anyone on the spot or preach about what you're doing wrong, call anyone out. The reality is a security program, and we're not going to cover everything. We're just going to cover a few key points that we see helping our customers. But a security program is extensive. It's a lot of time, it's a lot of effort, a lot of prioritization. That also includes business prioritization into where you're spending your money, where your focus is. And one of our key beliefs here at IntelliGO ActZero is in continuous improvement. So there's also that continuous improvement aspect. I'm really here to highlight the things that we've seen help customers, so people can make an informed decision on if it's right for them, knowing that this helps. And the one exception to this is if you're using weak passwords, like password is password, then I might actually go back on everything I just said and call you out on. But hopefully that's not the case. So security programs are really good for setting that baseline, and you need a policy in order to. The policy is really the foundation for everything that you do in an organization. It's what your end users need to follow. It's what your IT staff need to implement, and it's crucial. So you want to make sure you have policies. You want to have things like a simple example is a password policy. A password policy is what guides your users on what they need to enter, but it's also something that you can also teach them on, train them on. You have things like uppercase, lowercase, number, character, all that sort of thing. Now, once you've got that policy in place, then you need to educate your end users on those policies. They need to understand what's in this policy, how do I adhere to this policy, and why perhaps it's in place in the first place. That then leads you to training. I'll give an example of phishing, right? So you may have a policy on phishing. You may have educated your end users on that policy, but 94% of malware these days is delivered via email. Yet still, in 2021, people are clicking on these links. So that's pretty staggering. 94% of malware delivered by email. So you need to train those users. Those users need to be trained on the policy, trained in why they should be clicking this, trained in what to look for in a suspicious email, trained in how to notify your help desk or your vendor that might deal with that, or trained in using perhaps that report a phish button in your email platform. And then lastly, to kind of bring it full circle, is you also need to do testing. You need to do things like testing your users. Maybe there's lots of platforms out there where you can send fake phish emails and count how many people in your organization were clicking on it. So that you maybe need to go back and modify your policy or your training or your education. You also need to test for things like password length. You need to have IT controls in place to do these testing of what policy has been set and of the IT infrastructure in place to do it. And we see quite often in our journeys as a threat hunting team in dealing with these things that sometimes there's a real lack of this at a customer, where they may be getting alert fatigue because their users are clicking on so many phishing emails, antivirus alerts are going all over the place. They're going to miss something that's significant, and really you want to prevent that from happening. The other side of things as well, though, is great. You've got your program in place. People are working on not clicking on things, and patch management is the next thing that we see being really, really important. Why is it so important? Well, it is that sign of something coming that you need to deal with. It is that canary in the coal mine in a way. 60% of breaches, and I use a lot of these statistics from the Verizon report. If you're not familiar with it, I highly recommend checking it out. They do a report every year that covers a whole bunch of statistics around who did what and why, and what's being used by attackers, what's being leveraged. And 60% of breaches worldwide involved vulnerabilities for which a patch was available but not applied. So that means it could have been prevented. One of the things that was really interesting is that in some cases they did some research on an XIM vulnerability that was 12 years old. Okay, so they looked into this and they found it being exploited, of course, and it's not something that the attackers have to work hard for. If you're vulnerable to things that are 12 years old and it's not patched. In fact, what they also found was on machines that had that vulnerability, no patches at all in 12 years were applied. So these attackers have quite a handbook to be able to go through and use against someone who is not patching everything. But I hear, we can't patch this. We're not able to patch this machine because it's operational technology, it's old technology, it's a shop floor machine, it's vital to the business. So what can you do in that case, right? You have to find an alternative to reduce that impact and reduce that risk of a breach with those kinds of business critical machines. So you need to understand, first of all, what is the issue? What is the vulnerability? And vulnerability scanning really helps you with that. And once you've identified this, then you can use techniques like isolating the systems, and reducing the attack surface, or if there's a service running like a web server, yet you don't need that at all for the function of whatever this device may be, disable and block the services. And lastly, if you understand what the vulnerability is to these old operational technologies that you just can't upgrade because of the time or the money investment or whatever the case may be, then you can also look at ways of perhaps adding additional monitoring around those machines, looking for specifics that would apply if that vulnerability were to be exploited. So those are two of the key things, but yet the reality of today is that It's not a matter of if you're going to get breached, it's a matter of when you're going to get breached. And again, breach prevention and impact reduction. And the impact reduction side of things is a big part of that. It may be a simple thing where it's just someone's endpoint is what got breached. You didn't lose any data, and that's great as far as breaches go. But there's going to be a time when you need an incident response plan. So, why would you have an incident response plan? Why do you need an incident response plan? Well, the reason is it helps you understand in a time of crisis, in a critical moment, what you need to do, who you need to engage. And for those of you who might be familiar, there is obviously a life cycle. And what I'm going to be talking about is the preparation portion of your incident response plan. Be prepared. Have those systems then in place for identification, but having that incident response plan in preparation. As a side note, for our customers, we're normally involved in steps 3, 4, and 5. Containment, eradication, recovery. Yes, we might be involved in the identification, but when a breach is declared and an incident response is initiated, we're there to contain, eradicate, and recover for the duration of that active incident response. But that really also comes back to who does what within your plan. When you have a breach, you want to make sure that you have the right people there to quickly act and quickly reduce the impact of what is going on, prevent the spread of malware, lock things down if needed, find out what's happening. If you have everyone running around again, like chickens with their heads cut off, you're not going to be productive. You're going to miss things. And you also need to understand how your vendors fit into that. So in the case of the SolarWinds incident, if you need to declare an incident, how are you going to interact with that vendor in order to get the right information that you need to minimize this impact, to understand what you're looking for, to understand what you're looking at? And as well, if you also have, say, a firewall vendor who manages your firewalls, how do they fit into that? I had a previous lifetime example of that where we had a breach where I was, and I managed to find the command and control channel, and we told our firewall vendor to close it down and block it, to stop the command and control. And we were like, yes, great, we found this. We'd been up for 20 hours. When I went to sleep, I found out when I got back a few hours later that they hadn't actually blocked it. So make sure you understand how your vendors fit into your incident response program, because that was a horrible situation to be put in. That was, a few extra hours of these guys being able to communicate within an incident, and it should have been stopped. So understand how your vendors fit into that. So now we're going to talk a bit about technical solutions. Technical solutions are ones that our customers have either implemented or we have recommended they implement that have helped them in their time of need and stopping a breach and or reducing impact. So you've got software deployment, and first of all, this helps you with that patching problem. This helps you reduce the effort of patching those systems. It helps rapidly deploy changes and updates. If there was to be, say, again, SolarWinds, you need to deploy something, you have that deployment in place where you can push it out to everything that you need to and close that hole rapidly. You also have the chance of reducing human error. If you have someone who's manually doing things, we're humans, we're prone to error, and anything that we can do and leverage computer systems which have been put out here to help us with our problems, it allows you to do that testing to key groups, to key infrastructure. It helps you reduce the chance that someone's going to fat finger something, not install something on this machine, but get it on that one. it helps you manage that situation and help keep that in line. So software deployment, whatever it may be, we tend to recommend PDQ deploy simply because it's fairly simple and straightforward. But there's, of course, enterprise level Microsoft solutions. There's all sorts of stuff out there in order to manage software deployment. So it is one that we see greatly helping our customers. So email is another one. Going back to that statistic I said earlier about 95% of malware being delivered, 96 was it? That's a lot. So that email vector is, I would say, one of the largest threat vectors that we see in any of our incidents, in any of our research, proactively looking for issues when we're threat hunting. So what can you do to do that? Two-factor authentication, multi-factor authentication as well is something that we highly recommend. One of the biggest things going on these days is business email compromise. You read about it all the time. In fact, in the SolarWinds example, a business email compromise of Office 365 cloud infrastructure was rife. Sadly, it also turned out a lot of that reason was because of weak passwords. But two-factor authentication can help add that second layer of protection. It can help prevent brute forcing and credential stuffing. And that is when credential stuffing is when attackers have gathered potential passwords for users from your organization because of other breaches. So, for example, they've maybe popped LinkedIn, or they've gotten some website where your users are using the same credentials as they use corporately. Now, going back to what I was saying about policy, that's something you probably want to have in your policy to prevent. You probably want to tell people, please don't use personal passwords that are the same as your corporate infrastructure, but we see it time and time again. And that's why credential stuffing works. Just please don't recycle those passwords, people. But if that were to happen, two-factor authentication can help prevent that. But okay, great. We've stopped them from getting into our account and pretending that they're, in the accounting department of somewhere else and are telling our people to change that bank account to this bank account and taking all the money. Well, how does this help us with our that doesn't really help us with our problem of that inbound email that people are clicking on. So inbound email security is another critical control that you want to put in place. Then there's a lot of stuff you can do around this these days. There's email filtering. You can filter based on anything that looks like your CEO, for example. Attachment sandboxing. There's DMARC and other domain-based stuff like that for anti-spoofing on inbound email. There's URL rewriting, so any suspicious URLs get rewritten and can be investigated before a user can even click on them. And for the cloud, there's new technology, a relatively new technology that is still in line with all that on-prem stuff called cloud email security supplements. So really, if you have moved to the cloud or moved to the cloud, you want to make sure that that same inbound email security exists out there. And lastly, secure configuration. It's funny how many times attackers change their tactics, and now people have started to put two-factor authentication in place. Well, now they want to go and try to find the next way to get in there. And what they've been doing in some cases is getting in by exploiting unused components or legacy protocols like IMAP and POP. If your users aren't connecting with IMAP and POP, why do you have it running? You want to look at those sort of things and make sure your configuration for your email is as secure as possible. And you're taking those steps to disable things you don't need, you don't use, or can be exploited. The next one is a big one. And it's one that a lot of people don't like to do because it requires quote, quote, a lot of work. And that is a software restriction policy. I'm speaking in particular, most of our customers are Windows-based. So I'm talking about Windows software restriction policies that you can put in place via your domain policies or even local policies. But there is other technology that you can use for other operating systems as well. The real reason is why would you want to have a software restriction policy? It makes everything difficult. It makes people's lives miserable. I can't install XYZ software. Well, if we take a quick look here at how common vector, again, using this email example because obviously it's our biggest threat vector out there. Common vector is you get an email, it's got some sort of malware either attached to it or a link to malware or whatever the case may be. Someone clicks on it and it executes in your temporary folders, which is where your email and your web browser operate out of. That's where, if you go to a web page, any of the images on there download into that folder. So if something's going to happen, it's going to usually happen in the context of those folders. And having an executable run in those folders doesn't make any sense. There are sometimes plugins like Grammarly that'll do it, but really, why do you need to have new executables popping on there? Because most of the stuff shouldn't be an executable. If your finance guy's opening an Excel spreadsheet, Excel's the executable, not the spreadsheet. So what happens in this vector is it runs, that endpoint gets compromised, and then the attacker gets a little notification, and he starts to move laterally in your organization, and he's everywhere. So why would you want a software restriction policy? Well, it's because if you stop it here, you don't have a problem anymore. If that malware can't execute because your software restriction policy says, no, this is not allowed to run here, this is not something that should be running here, then you don't ever have to worry about the compromise and spread. You stop it dead right there. So we had a situation where a customer unfortunately had a breach. It was 0 day. And in one of the meetings, one of the discussions as part of the incident response, we told them, look, get software restriction policy in place right away, block this thing from running where it's running. It was running in temporary directories and spreading that way. Sure enough, they did it, they got it done, contained it. We were very happy to hear that they did that. We helped them do that. But the question, of course, came up, that awkward question that always happens in a situation like this where finger pointing starts. It's like, why didn't you guys tell us to do this before? And luckily, we had one of the people at the client who we talked to constantly said, well, to be fair, they did. They've been telling us every month during our monthly report meetings. Of course, that must have been a very awkward thing to tell, one of your upper management. So the next question, of course, was, well, why didn't we do it? Well, it wasn't a priority at the time. It's too complicated. All these things. This is what happens when people talk about software restriction policies. They don't really want to put the effort, and a lot of that's because they don't understand it. But don't overcomplicate it. Put it on your crown jewels first. Don't worry about the end user. If they brick a laptop or you have to re-image a laptop, that is nothing compared to having to re-image and do your entire Active Directory infrastructure, your file servers, right? So focus on the crown jewels, because your crown jewels, from a software perspective, should only be updating, with rare exceptions where you may need to put some new software on, but you can manage that process. Your Active Directory server shouldn't be having executables running in temp, for example. In fact, you probably shouldn't have executables being put on generally anywhere unless it's part of an update. So, which of course you can manage via policy. So don't overcomplicate it. Focus on the crown jewels and get those key systems locked down and safe to help reduce the impact if there were to be a breach. Over time, you can start looking at expanding that out, maybe targeting end users that are low maintenance, leave your power users for last, that sort of thing, and log and maintain, because this also can become a canary in the coal mine. What it can do is it can help you notify, wow, this endpoint or this Active Directory server has a whole bunch of stuff trying to run. That shouldn't be happening. We need to look at this right away. It may be you find out, okay, great, Joe in accounting overseas, I was working with an IT guy there, they needed a new update. Okay, but you can maintain that and maintain that policy to handle those situations. but you really need to keep an eye on those logs and deal with that over time. All right. So we'll skip right past this again, and we'll talk about endpoint detection and response. So endpoint detection and response, that's part of the core of our managed detection and response business as well. But why endpoint detection and response? Well, antivirus captures, depending on the year, 75 to 80% roughly of malware, which is a lot. You don't want to go and say, okay, you know what, I'm pulling antivirus off of all my endpoints, because it does stop those things. But the problem is it's signature based. It doesn't deal with polymorphic malware very well. And you've still got, 15 to 25% of malware that's just going to completely evade your antivirus. So endpoint detection and response gives you that heightened visibility on your endpoints into things like processes and unusual executions that you wouldn't get from antivirus. It also gives the ability to, if something suspicious is going on, to quarantine those endpoints, to take them off the network, continue to investigate them, which is really key, because traditional old school forensics, you would have to image the machine and start looking at forensics and going really deep. With EDR, you kind of get a happy medium where you can pull it off the network, everything's safe, but still look into what's going on and do a very high level forensic investigation, if you will. This also gives you a faster response time. So you're not waiting until an antivirus signature updates and now you're getting a detection, right? These EDR helps you identify things quicker and respond to them quicker. You can get right on that machine. You can start looking at what's happening, and it gives you that insight from that visibility that you can then respond to in an IR situation. And also it adds things like coverage of behaviors. So things behaving a certain way. It's not a case of it's looking at, okay, this user clicked on this at this time and that's unusual. But it does look at the behavior of operating system files, things that are happening, what it's doing. Again, that really just helps with your visibility. So now we're getting into the part that's really important for our organization to talk about, because it's what we do. And again, I'd probably get strung up by marketing if I didn't talk about it. The best of both worlds, managed detection response. So what is it? It's a service. It's a service that uses people, processes, and the platform to secure your environment. MDRs don't do alerting where you get flooded with alert fatigue where, okay, you had a brute force again today, you had a brute force again today, you had a brute force again today, which is internet noise. What happens instead is we triage and take action on behalf. So, for example, with our ransomware detection, we would have quarantined that machine the second that was detected, and then had someone look and see what was going on, see if there was further action needed, if it was big, if it was small. You can rest at ease at 2 in the morning. Don't worry, Mr. Customer, if you happen to be reading this right now, you can go back to bed. So that's the managed aspect of the service. But we also use things like big data analytics and machine learning and all these things to also help filter through the noise to identify, here's the really important things that you need human eyes on to take a look at. And deal with. So, what's that difference? Obviously, cross-vector coverage, not just endpoint, which is the EDR, but managed detection response also takes into things like network, cloud, Office 365 account takeover detections, these sort of things. The machine learning, which I already mentioned, not only is it a visibility into a single client, it is all our clients, which means better protection because we are able to use that base of customers to generate new detections, to see more things across, rather than if it was a single company, your lens is usually just yourself, or if you managed to get threat intel information, you might get some bits and pieces of other information from others, but it's not massive data at scale. Of course, automation means that you don't have the same costs as going alone, right? We can do it's not static based, right? It covers these other areas, and then there's a human in the loop. They can take that action, they can do that investigation, and all that happens before you see it. When you're looking at automation, if someone were to do this alone on NDR, they have to get the staff and the skill sets in order to do that. So with a managed service, you don't have to worry about that. Those highly skilled people are already there. They're already available. You don't have to worry about if they're going to leave next week or not in your organization, because it's a service that is provided to you. So I think we're coming up to 45 minutes there. I know it was talking fairly quickly for 45 minutes. I think we may have a couple questions that popped up. So first of all, here's some resources that we have available. Again, that'll be available to you after this is shared out to you. We've got our 2021 cyber predictions and our elite incident response guide. And thank you all for coming and attending. You can ask me anything. I'll let my assistant Tosin here come up with some of the things that can be addressed. So feel free to ask questions. Okay, so one question I've got here is antivirus sufficient to protect us from a breach? I think, going back to my comment about it protecting 75 to 80, 85%, I think the answer is pretty clearly no, it's not. I think antivirus is, again, not something that you want to do away with because it protects you from a huge amount of problems. However, you can just tell by the amount in the news over the past number of years, it's not enough to prevent a breach, and it's not enough to reduce impact. It's great to catch the things that are already really well known, but not very good at catching the unknown and really identifying it. And it's not very good at dealing with an incident when it happens. So you need, again, some of those things that I mentioned in place, both from a policy, security program and a technical standpoint, but also something like endpoint detection response or another layer in that defense in depth that helps you. We see a lot of cases where we're looking at something and the antivirus has caught it, and that's great. So we're like, okay, great, that layer has helped. That layer has blocked things. We don't get any more information because it was snatched out by antivirus and quarantined, and that's amazing. But we also have an equal number of times where that is not the case, and we need to dig deeper and look further into it. So another question is other additional alternatives to patching. So obviously upgrading is one of them. When we're talking about that, it's something that's going to be based on what that system is and what the vulnerability is in terms of what you can do about it. It may be you do a combination of things. You might put it on its own network segment, or that floor on its own network segment. You lock it down so that only certain ports are open to that segment. You lock it down so that only certain users are able to do it. You reduce that surface area and make it so that it's really hard to exploit that vulnerability for that old system. I mean, in an ideal world, if everyone had all the money in the world to be able to deal with this sort of problem, you'd want to upgrade. You'd want to use something more modern, but those are often very big projects, companies have invested a lot of money in that operational technology, so it's not time to be able to do that. So you really need to look at those other additional alternatives. In some cases, why do they even need to be on a network that is linked to something public facing at all anyways? We see this with things like nuclear power plants getting breached. I mean, I don't get it. You know, why? You know, deep government secret agencies as well. Why not air gap it? Okay, just seeing if there's any other questions here. All right, looks like we don't have any other questions. Of course, subsequent to this, feel free to, you can always follow up with us on anything in the presentation. We'll be looking to also put some additional information out there on our blog. Thank you once again for your time and coming to be with us here today. Obviously, we had a couple resources, but there are a lot more on our website, which, as mentioned, within the next couple of days is going to be changing to ActZero.ai. But in the meantime, it's IntelliGoNetworks.com. Please rate the webinar. Feedback is welcome. You know, especially in this day and age, we really want to know what we can help you and our customers achieve. Oh, hold on. There's one last question sneaking into the wire here. We've got time, so I'll definitely answer that. Oh, well, thank you very much. And I appreciate your time. Thanks very much. All right, everyone. Cheers. Stay safe in these crazy times. Have a great week. And thank you once again for your time and attending.